Reports that South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has been uninvited from the upcoming G7 summit in Evian-le-Bain, France, scheduled for June 2026. The South African presidency has reportedly pointed to sustained pressure from the United States President Donald Trump, with some sources even suggesting that Washington threatened a full boycott of the summit if South Africa was permitted to attend. This latest snub follows a series of escalating tensions between Pretoria and the Trump administration over issues ranging from South Africa's foreign policy stances to domestic land reform narratives. To help make sense of the continuation of hostilities for South Africa's global standing and, of course, our crucial trade relations, we're joined now by senior political economist at the Trade Collective, Dr Lebohang Pheko. A very good evening to you, Dr. Pheko, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you so much, Ms. Makwetla.
This has been continuing, and even the latest reports of what South Africa, America's new ambassador to South Africa, the statements that he's been making. I suppose it's no surprise that it's come to this, but I think the point that one is really looking into is Washington leaning on France to rescind South Africa's G7 invite. It's reminiscent of what happened of the G20, calls for the global community to try and reach some sense in terms of speaking to Washington or preserving global trade ties and diplomatic ties. Just what are your thoughts about what really happens behind closed doors that France would agree to this?
So, the incident highlights the growing fracturing of international arrangements, the etiquette of them all, the politeness of them all, and the fact that there seems to be a coercive atmosphere behind the scenes. It also centers the US's America First aggression as almost the default position, and really reinstills this normativity in the US's relationship to the rest of the world, very much setting them up as the pole, the constellation around which every other planet in the global order seems to revolve, which is extremely unproblematic. It also shows that even though they might not be overt commands or demands, it's hard to say. There certainly seems to be implicit pressure. There certainly seems to be the promise of implied consequence or the implication of consequences. And there certainly seems to be the threat of disruption, whether that's a boycott or whether that's some more trade and tariff wars, whether that's some kind of social political sanction of some kind. So this is how power seems to be working right now, not through per se formal orders or formal persuasion, but rather through making alternatives much too costly. So we see the US on a dual track. So you see a very aggressive approach, say, in the case of Nicolas Maduro, what's happening now in Cuba. And then you also see what seems to be a slightly more sinister, quiet implication of boycott or of being excluded from the big boys and girls club.
And speaking of big boys and girls club, America has never made it a secret that it considers itself the superpower, therefore the leader of the group, so to speak. But more importantly, was it a result of cosmetic change? The fact that South Africa was even part of the G7 to begin with, that this is hierarchy really exerting its power and influence, that it would have come to this at some point?
Maybe it would have, Tepiso, because remember that the Group of Seven has increasingly functioned more as a coordination mechanism for like-minded powers. Countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa have been invited at the pleasure of these other dominating founding members. And that was really more of a concession to the fact that the world is that there is a semblance of multipolarity, that the world has moved quite significantly since the formation of the G7, but also I think in a more cynical sense, a recognition that it's almost impossible to ignore Black and brown people in this world, and attempt to also try to ensure and assure themselves of some kind of economic interest, access to resources, access to different trade agreements and so forth. And these being three extremely important and influential countries across the respective regions. I think the other thing is that though the inclusion, let's not forget, has always been conditional, it has always been politically motivated, and sometimes just quite instrumental and rather transactional.
And just latching on to the word instrumental, South Africa wasn't just excluded, it was replaced, and with Kenya. And looking at the moves that Kenya has made politically, and cozying up to the United States, the things that President William Ruto has done, which she's been criticized as being permissive to America's whims. Is this a strategic substitution, or is this just plain and simple telling South Africa that you are replaceable, know your place?
Not that important. So I think the fact that they had to find some sort of a super sub is interesting in and of itself. So it could be evidence of a couple of things, that it's not just about regional rebalancing, but that it indicates a preference for alignment over the sort of political independence that South Africa often shows at moments of great that are important. It could also signal that they're selecting a partner who is much less likely to challenge the agenda. And as you rightly say, President Ruto, who has a litany of his own domestic woes, the insurrections and the resistances of the Gen X over the last year and a half in Kenya as well, have signaled that he himself is on the back foot in many respects. He has been leaning increasingly towards naked authoritarianism, and certainly a model of governance which is problematic, to say the least. And I think it's fair to say that perhaps Kenya at the moment is viewed as more compatible to the idea of a more compliant African voice and African representative.
And then there is South Africa's domestic policy that's constantly being raised. And I was quite intrigued looking at the reactions on X, particularly from white South Africans, pointing to President Cyril Ramaphosa's leadership, throwing in racism in there, the usual ANC pot kettle lid, etc., into the mix. The question is whether transformation agendas are now being read externally as markers of alignment in a polarized world.
So, I mean, remember when we think around things like land policy, that's been one of the big thorns in the side of neoliberal Western powers who are resistant to the idea of African sovereignty. Our BRICS alignment, which has also come under some scrutiny, and remember the ultimatum, more or less implicit, in fact quite explicit, that was laid out for us at some stage, that it's either BRICS or the US, really strong armed tactics, no diplomacy whatsoever. And of course, our positions on Israel, Palestine, and now Iran as well. Our historical relationship also with Cuba, our historical relationships with Nicaragua, Venezuela, and so forth. So this, as you say, this is not only these are not seen as merely domestic issues, but they are playing themselves out in the international terrain. Recently, the putrid remarks made by the incoming ambassador to South Africa about BEE and so forth, about some of the songs, the struggle songs that have been sung, which in his mind point to the veracity of some kind of a white genocide. And I think even President Trump, and any sane-minded person are fully aware that there is is no genocide. But what has been interesting is the narrative power that it garnered in order to distract the world and from really much more important issues. The other thing is that creates a situation and a binary where internal autonomous situations and internal transformative decisions that are really within our remit to make are then externally politicized and weaponized.
All right. Hold the thought, Ms. Pheko, because I want to continue along that train of thought, non-alignment, straddling multiple power centers. Just a quick break and we'll be back with you in just a moment.
Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
In conversation with Dr Lebohang Pheko, political economist, regarding news that South Africa has been uninvited from the G7 meeting by France as a result of reported pressure from the United States. Before we took that quick break, Dr Pheko, you were talking about political autonomy, and I want to ask the question. There's some who are suggesting that perhaps Pretoria overestimated the space for strategic non-alignment. Others are saying that there is shrinking room for diplomatic ambiguity. Is it really diplomatic ambiguity or multiple power centers, or simply, as you say, countries exercising their international rights to set domestic policy?
Well, it depends which countries. So if we're talking about countries of the minority world, Europe, Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, of course, that's a whole different kettle of fish because of the power dynamics. And of course, non-alignment has always been very important, particularly to non-European, non-Western countries, as it were, particularly because we didn't want to get caught up in wars that had nothing to do with us. We didn't want to be caught up in proxy battles coming out of the traditions of first post-colonialism and liberation struggles and the Cold War. That was one of the great poles of around which the non-alignment was even developed, and the new global order and the kind of international relations that people, especially African scholars and Asian scholars in the early 1970s were trying to think around in very creative ways. So really what I think is happening right now is that the system is becoming much less tolerant of that sort of autonomy and that kind of ambiguity. And when I say the system as set and the system as conceptualized in the image of United States-centric power, in the image of a system where the United States is a center of consideration of economic, military, political, security power, and increasingly all other forms, cultural power and so forth. Non-alignment worked very well in a bipolar world during the Cold War, where we could avoid being on either side of these strange battles, which really had nothing to do with us. But now it seems that the lines have become much, much harder. Expectations of overt coerciveness have become much, much clearer. And the penalties, even though they might be slightly more subtle than the extrajudicial killings we saw a generation ago, e.g., President Saddam Hussein, e.g., Colonel Gaddafi, e.g., Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Maurice Bishop, and so forth, and maybe to some extent the removal of somebody like Nicolas Maduro begins to signal to that kind of a return to that kind of crassness. But certainly the penalties have been subtle over the last 5 to 10 years, but still tangible. And what we're seeing now is a complete, I think, a denuding of any illusion of multipolarity, and I think an attempt to reassert unipolarity, which is something I don't think we have seen in a long time, with the US trying very hard to assert itself. Fortunately, for what it's worth, we do have strong poles like China, like Russia, And we also have other strong poles, like, for example, the so-called the middle countries, as coined by the Prime Minister of Canada, including Canada itself, right? Including countries like Turkey, including countries like Brazil, for example, like India. And I would actually posit that a country like South Africa would potentially, if we had a lot more diplomatic courage and I think the ability to if we're able to harness our own sovereignty, could also be one of those influential powers to then begin to resist this ascendance of what seems to be a unipolar, completely imperial universe.
Thank you so much, as always, for your time and insight. Senior political economist at the Trade Collective, Dr Lebohang Pheko, weighing in on South Africa being uninvited from the G7 summit in June.